Ladies and gents, PepperBelly here, and welcome back to another video. Now, I want to be discussing in this video something that I thoroughly enjoyed from the past that has been revitalized by the community in a similar way that I've talked about in the past for Fear Combat. If you guys remember the video I put out a long time ago where I said Fear Combat was rediscovered, it's because the community decided to take matters into their own hands and develop the game somewhat so that it's still playable and has actual functioning servers where it's accessible to everybody who wants to get in on it. Well, the fine folks over at 25Assist have done the same thing with this. 25Assist is what it's actually called, which is basically a community-made effort to revitalize and give life to America's Army 2.5. Yeah, again, this was done back in like 2010, I believe, so it is quite old, alright? This is not new. This whole 25Assist thing has been around for about 6 years, give or take. So, what I'm making this video about is because obviously lately I've been covering a lot of tactical shooters, a lot of military simulators, and all that kind of realistic, authentic greatness. And obviously this is one of the greats from the past. This was originally created as a recruiting tool by the US Army, in addition to just being a free game for people to play for fun. And obviously there was a heavy focus on realism, but at the same time it was still gamey enough that it was enjoyable without being a little bit too over excessive in the realism department. The thing is though, they eventually evolved it to be slightly more realistic, and I'll get to that in a second because, as I said, this is America's Army 2.5. So this is actually technically the second iteration of America's Army, because America's Army was originally a standalone title just called America's Army. And it had basic qualifications, so you had to go and do actual training to be able to qualify to go online and compete in multiplayer. And you had to unlock, say, the M203 or an ACOG as a marksman, or designated marksman, or whatever the case may be, so that you can actually use it online. You couldn't use them otherwise. And then they came out with America's Army Operations, which is what this is. And then they came out with America's Army Special Forces. Special Forces came out around 2.8. So this is 2.5. And a lot of changes happened between 2.5 to 2.8. A lot of big noticeable ones. The thing to keep in mind with this version, 25Assist, which is 2.5, they actually imported a lot of the assets from 2.8.5, which is the latest version of America's Army before it went into America's Army 3, which was built on a whole new engine, which was Unreal Engine 3. This is built on Unreal Engine 2, same as the original America's Army game. What's lacking from 2.8.5, which I'm going to address now because honestly, I really wish this was 2.8.5, because 2.8.5 to me is a far superior America's Army experience. 2.5 played more like a game. It had the ability to quickly strafe back and forth, which you'll see a lot of. There's a lot of that strafe dodging and shooting at the same time. It's fairly fast-paced. Like, you can still play this game in a very aggressive manner with quick reflexes and hip firing or shooting from the shoulder, point shooting. And although point shooting is very inaccurate for the most part, you could still just spray and kill people. And the thing about this is that a lot of people tend to run around with burst fire, which is interesting because in real life, you don't use burst fire. Most soldiers will never touch burst fire in their life. Semi-automatic is king, fully automatic for suppression or close quarters when you need to desperately kill whoever the hell you're shooting at. So it's interesting to see that America's Army obviously acclimated to having tons and tons of just spray fest at times, which is kind of what 2.5 is. Now, it's not nearly as bad in 2.8.5, and the reason why is because they actually toned back the scale and speed of the game. They intentionally slowed things down. They actually scaled it back, I would say 10 to 20% in the speed, so that it actually plays slower and more methodically like a traditional tactical shooter, and that's what I thoroughly enjoyed about it, since it brought out even more realism, which is initially what they were setting out to do in the first place. Now, not only that, but they also added more training missions, a couple of new interesting weapons, co-op, which is a huge deal, and a vehicle. So they added the Humvee with the Crows mounted 50 caliber machine gun on top. Once all of that was added, this was quite literally the apex of America's Army as a game franchise, because everything after this kind of went downhill. America's Army 3 came out, although it kind of maintained some of what made America's Army 2 great and improved some of the gameplay and kind of made it a little bit more fast-paced yet again, but in a way that felt realistic. Like, it didn't do things in a way that kind of felt too arcadey. It still felt like a slow, methodical tactical shooter, and it played really well, but it was also more fast-paced. It kind of went back to the way that 2.5 initially was. 2.8.5 maintained that slow, methodical, more realistic nature and gameplay style, whereas 2.5 and America's Army 3 are almost similar in nature, minus weapon handling and things being completely different in that regard. But 2.8.5 to me was the best because of the addition of the Humvee, which had awesome physics at the time, and the Crow's mounted machine gun, using the 50 cal on top through remote control, was insanely awesome. And doing co-op missions was the highlight of my America's Army playtime. Every single time I played that game, all I really cared about was doing co-op, because the missions were actually really well structured and felt awesome to complete as a team, because all the co-op missions were actually special operations. All right, you weren't really able to do co-op until you completed all the special ops courses and acquired all the mandatory qualifications to be able to actually get the gear and equipment you need to be able to go and do those missions. And when you did, you had access to a Humvee. So you'd actually be rolling across these massive environments in the desert, sitting up on top of a hill. You get your guys to step out, they take out their binoculars, and they would just call out targets for the Crow's machine gun. He would just sit there with the 50 cal, start picking off targets around compounds, just annihilating people. And it just felt so cool. And then you would go in after that on foot. You drive up to a certain point, you disembark, and then you conduct your operations, whatever the objective is, which there was a variety of different objectives. It played a lot like the multiplayer aspect of the game, where certain teams would have objectives to complete, but very rarely would those objectives in multiplayer actually get completed, because most of the time the games would just turn into a last man standing style team deathmatch, where basically everyone goes around fighting and hunting each other, killing everyone off until the team has no more players left. And objectives would only get completed if there was like a long stalemate and a long lull in the firefight, when there's like 2 people remaining, 1 on each team. And then one guy would kind of sneak around and try to complete the objectives while the other person's hunting them. And that's kind of what would happen. But in co-op, these objectives are actually mandatory to complete the mission. You can't just go around, kill off all the enemy, and then the mission is done. You have to actually go and complete these objectives. And one mission I distinctly remember that I played through a lot is this vast forest. You start off in a forest, and you move into an underground facility, and you have to hack computers and get intelligence and gather all this information, and just kind of kill your way through the facility. If you can avoid the enemy, try to, because it's not about confronting the enemy, it's just about gathering intelligence. But the thing is, it's a heavily fortified area. There's tons of guards and like soldiers all over the place. So you end up having to fight your way through. You're flashbanging rooms. You know, you're throwing frag grenades in the rooms and into like the pipeline area at the basement or whatever the hell it is, right? And you're just like completing the objectives. And the whole thing is very tactical and very slow paced and very thought out and methodical, which is what tactical shooters are supposed to be. And playing co-op in America's Army helped to deliver that experience. Because when you go online, in almost every game ever, especially if it's a really hardcore, tactical, realistic shooter, you're still going to find those people that find out how to exploit the game so they can do all this ridiculous shit to gain an advantage. And it looks really gamey. It doesn't look realistic anymore. And America's Army it falls prone to that whole jumping, bunny hopping thing I talked about in my last video, where I discuss how, you know, I hate bunny hopping in games, right? I hate the idea that players can jump in a game that's supposed to be realistic. Even though a soldier can jump in real life, you're not going to jump on the spot and do all this weird twisting and turning and trying to evade bullets in real life. That just doesn't work, and it'll get you killed. And obviously there's hitboxes and latency issues, and that's why you can get away with that kind of stuff in a game. America's Army 3 actually went in the right direction with this in that regard, because they actually got rid of the entire jumping mechanic altogether and replaced it with a mantling and vaulting system, which to me was far superior. So you were able to just vault and climb over things, and you couldn't jump. So it actually made the gameplay have this more realistic depiction, where people weren't doing all this crazy shit. People were actually hunkering down in positions, taking up a firing position and trying to engage people. They weren't jumping out windows and doing ridiculous stuff, kind of like that. So that's one benefit America's Army 3 had over America's Army 2. But the whole point is, playing co-op helped to deliver, again, that realistic, authentic experience of completing special ops missions that just felt so damn good. Because you had to go into the area, you had to complete your objectives, and then you had to get to an extraction point. And although there was no real insertion or extraction, you kind of just started in one area and then you would run to another area and it would say mission complete because you extracted. it was still there. You know, it wasn't just like complete the objective and then it's a loading screen and the mission is done. You still had to get from point A to point B to point C. And it felt awesome. Like, it was one of the best experiences I've had. And it's unfortunate that in 25Assist, co-op is just not possible pretty much at all. Right now, there is no co-op support because the current build of Unreal they're using doesn't even have the AI scripts needed to be able to give the game proper AI for co-op. It can be done with a lot of work, but the thing is, nobody wants to put in the work because, unfortunately, 25Assist is dying. It has a limited player base. If you actually look at America's Army 3 right now, it has about the same player base as 25Assist. And that's not very good. Because 25Assist and just America's Army 2 is undoubtedly superior than America's Army 3. America's Army 3 is still a good game and still has its strong points, but it's plagued with issues like terrible netcode and strange latency issues, and the servers are all hosted in foreign areas, and it's just the whole game doesn't play as smoothly as America's Army 2. America's Army 2 is very responsive. America's Army 3, although has better mechanics because it's a newer game and has a lot more fleshed out things, it's just, it has piss poor connection issues and netcode, and you're shooting someone 2 feet in front of you, and it has this really terrible hit detection, and it needs to be addressed. If you were able to deliver, like if the same guys who made 25Assist right now grabbed America's Army 3 and recreated the launcher and did everything they did to 25Assist and recreated it for America's Army 3, it would undoubtedly probably be the superior version of America's Army. But unfortunately, I don't think they can do that because they can't even really, for some reason, they can't even get a hold of 2.8.5. I don't know why they can't. I don't know the details of that because personally I would prefer 2.8.5. But the thing about 2.5 is it's also cross-platform. It supports Linux and Mac, whereas 2.8.5, after 2.5, they didn't have Linux and Mac support anymore. So that's why when 2.8.5 was even officially released and it was live and active back in the day, 2.5 was still very popular alongside 2.8 because of that very reason, because 2.5 was the only cross-platform version. Everything after that, there was no longer support for it. So that's actually one of the reasons why they wanted to keep 2.5, because even though a small minority of the community actually has Linux and Mac, it just makes it more accessible, thereby granting more people access to the game to boost the numbers, because obviously not a lot of people are going to be playing this, and obviously if you restrict it back to just Windows, those who have Linux and Macs are going to be screwed over and not be able to play, where before, with 2.5, they can't. As I said before, I prefer the changes that 2.8.5 offered, especially the co-op in the vehicles, but I mean, 2.5 is better than nothing, and the game actually plays like a dream. The problem is the fact that the community is actually dying and it's getting smaller and smaller, so the reason why I wanted to bring this video to your attention is because if you guys are interested at all in this type of game, you want free access to a free game, because this game was initially free to begin with, and now it's free yet again, you can download it. You can go to the website, you can download the installer, you can install it, it's very simple, very easy to install, it doesn't even have like a registry entry on your computer, it's just a file that you can just delete. You don't have to actually go through an uninstall process, you just delete the file when you're done with the game. So it's a lot simpler to actually just get the game up and running, and it's a lot of fun. If you're like me, and you hate what America's Army became, because America's Army Proving Grounds is an abomination, alright? Like, I'm just gonna go ahead and say that flat out. I know it has a player base, I know there's like 1,000 people playing it on average, but I detest that game. America's Army Proving Grounds is like an insult to the America's Army franchise. America's Army 2, as I said, was the apex. America's Army 3 tried to improve some aspects of it, but kind of fell short in a lot of other areas. Proving Grounds just went in the completely opposite direction, essentially ruining everything. Which sucks, because I do not like Proving Grounds at all. So if you want a more realistic tactical shooter, that's free to play, and you can get your hands on it right away, and you had an interest in maybe America's Army, or you played it in the past and weren't sure it's been revitalized, here it is. My name's been PepperBelly. Thank you guys for joining me today on this video, and I'll see you in the next one.